Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to my podcast, Don't Get a Therapist Yet. So it's Wendy here, your accredited CBT and EMDR therapist. So today we're talking about a controversial subject, diagnosis in mental health. Is it helpful or is it harmful? And the short answer is it can be both. One way of thinking of diagnosis is like a map. It can point you to the right road, but it doesn't tell you everything about the journey or the weather or who's in the car with you. So let's start by talking about why a diagnosis can help you. So, point number one, it fast tracks the right help. So, when your set of problems actually has a name, it can actually help services know what to offer. Classic example is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It opens doors to trauma-focused therapies like cognitive behavior therapy or EMDR. If you have social anxiety or OCD, there are specific cognitive behavior therapy protocols that work really well with these particular problems. Or what happens if you have bipolar or even psychosis. Even there are clear plans and monitoring systems to help keep you as safe and as well as you can be. However, there can be a problem with this, as the research can be so disorder specific, whereas there can be so many variables to a person's number of problems, and it doesn't mean that everybody can fit into a single diagnosis. Some are far more complex. However, another benefit is it gives us a shared language. So, if, for example, I say panic disorder, the whole team, the GP, therapist, psychiatrist, would therefore know what we're talking about: unexpected panic attacks and fear of future panic attacks. And this can help us all to coordinate care and explain things more clearly to you, your family, and your loved ones. Point number three, it can unlock practical support. So in the UK, a diagnosis can help with the workplace or school adjustments, and it can make it easier to access certain NHS treatments or pathways or online services. Number four, it can feel validating to that person. So I hear a number of people saying, I thought it was just me being weak. Now I understand what's going on. A diagnosis can help reduce feelings of self-blame, shame, self-criticism, and actually encourage the individual to go and seek help. Number five, it can actually help services improve. So actually having some kind of form of diagnosis allows the NHS and all the researchers to track the outcomes. And that's how we really learn to understand and know what is working and also where to invest resources, because resources are always tight and we're always having to bear that in mind. However, there's lots of problems with diagnosis and they can backfire. So the first really obvious one is stigma. Stigma, public stigma, stigma to the individual, stigma from your organization as well. So once you have a label, this can really help to attract stereotyping. People, once they have a label put on them, might fear being judged, or they might even judge themselves. Sometimes these systems build rules around labels that can limit access or create hoops that people have to jump through. So the label effect. So the second example is when a label is applied, then other people can start viewing you as seeing everything through your label. Oh, there you are, you're being anxious again. When actually, you could be anxious about a number of things. You could be anxious about having a medical condition or a completely new separate problem, but you just get labeled, oh, that's anxious. There's a term for that. It's called diagnostic overshadowing. And it's risky because it can actually miss things. I remember somebody a long time ago having a lot of pain in her back. And because she had a mental health problem, she was just labeled, oh, it's just part of your mental health problem. And it wasn't. She had cancer and it was missed simply because she was labeled. Point number 3. So having fuzzy boundaries. So some labels, diagnostic categories are crystal clear, but the problem is so many more are far more complex than that. We need to understand that human distress, it doesn't always fit neatly into these diagnostic categories. The problem is we can end up forcing a fit or missing the bigger picture of your life. Stress, trauma, relationships, sleep, money worries, and they might not fit into this label. The other problem is that you might be mislabeled as well. We'll talk about that a bit later. Number 4, the consequences of being labeled. So once you've got a label, that might affect your insurance, it might affect legal forms, it might affect risk assessments. Sometimes labels change how systems respond to people. You can actually feel more like you're a code rather than seen as an individual person. Number 5, it can also affect access to treatment. So if you've been labelled anxious, there is a clear treatment plan. However, another example is if you're suffering from trauma, unless you fall into the diagnostic category of PTSD, post-trauma distress disorder, then there's no treatment plan. So you have to have a different label, such as adjustment disorder. So then if you have the wrong treatment, but you have trauma, but you've been labelled as having an adjustment disorder, you may be given a different amount of sessions and it might not cover the actual original problem, which is a trauma rather than an adjustment disorder. And also, if it's not labelled as a trauma, then therapists such as EMDR might not be open to you. You say, oh, no, it's not. It's not a trauma because you don't tick all the boxes for PTSD. Therefore, it must be something else. Therefore, you can't possibly have a trauma therapy such as EMDR. So, and actually can actually be the entirely wrong treatment because people are too limited in their understanding of what trauma is. So, are some diagnoses more helpful than others? Well, this can happen if there is a very well evidence-based, researched clinical pathway. So examples of that is PTSD, OCD, social anxiety, depression. Naming these often points to a very strong, specific treatment plan that works. Even with psychosis and bipolar, diagnosis can help us to organise medication, therapy, and also to help us to deal with difficulties such as problems or relapse prevention. Neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD or autism, often a formal diagnosis can be the real key to making reasonable adjustments at school or work. And I know a lot of people, there's a lot of people perhaps in their elder years or mid-age years as well, not even elder, who actually feel that they have had ADHD or autism. It's been undiagnosed. And actually having a late diagnosis, they said, has made such a difference in their life because they understand how their brain works. And for them, it's been very, very useful. However, there are other labels, such as borderline personality disorder or BPD for short. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. There's a lot of stigma around BPD, and this can be much heavier than for other labels. I often hear people with BPD tell me they've sometimes felt dismissed or described as difficult. And that's not okay. That is not evidence-based care. So here's a balance. So the downside is BPD can really attract negative assumptions from the public and sadly, often from professionals as well. And this can mean much poorer experiences and people withdrawing from services. However, in a good service, this label can actually access well-known effective therapies such as dialectical behavior therapy, DBT for short, and mentalization-based treatment, MBT for short. And these therapies can be really life-changing. So when we use a diagnosis with care, with compassion, and also pair it up with a personalised plan, not just a list of symptoms with a tick box, a plan that is personalised to the individual. This can be the right way to actually access help and the treatment to fit the person. So, in my opinion, a diagnosis can be helpful and it can tell me a list of problems about that particular individual, and I can quickly and easily provide some treatment plans and some interventions for that person. Panic disorder is a classic. I can very quickly explain what panic disorder is, and I can recommend some interventions around panic disorder. However, it's really important that I look at skills training. So whatever the problem or the diagnosis, things such as emotional regulation, distress tolerance, interpersonal skills, how to build a compassionate understanding of yourself can all really help just as much as any diagnosis. And that's probably much more important and more effective for the individual. Also, the individual feels heard and understood, and it is actually part of the plan as well. There's no point in actually having a plan which doesn't actually suit them either. The other problem is that sometimes the diagnosis is wrong or it's been changed. I've known people who've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and actually it's really complex trauma. And therefore, they've had the wrong medication, they've had the wrong treatment plans, as I said earlier, because actually people have different opinions as to what the diagnosis is. So, how do I personally use diagnosis in my CBT practice? So diagnosis on its own doesn't really help. But if you add a formulation, this is the best of both worlds. So diagnosis tends to tell us what tends to happen. Formulation tells us why it's happening for you. So together they shape a plan that fits your life. It's like it's all very well having a title of a book, but you need to read the book, which is a formulation, to actually get the benefit. It's really important that if there is a stigma, it's named. So, for example, a bias such as BPD or psychosis, we can have discussions about this. We can talk about how to advocate for yourself, to make sure that you can access the appropriate services, to actually make sure that the words used are appropriate and they're not sort of too negative or critical. I also make sure that new symptoms aren't forgotten about or dismissed or addressed. It's really important that everything is out there. It's important that I don't just stuff things under a label. It's really important in therapy we continue to evaluate, reassess. So if you've got chest pain, it could be all kinds of things. It could be stress, it could be a physical health condition, it could be serious. And it's about building the tools to make sure you manage that the best you can. Or say your mood shifts in a new way. So it's really important we ask the good questions. We look at the treatment plan. We might review medication. We might look at sleep patterns. We might need to go back and have more tests by your GP, test your thyroid. We might need to discuss whether you're having enough iron. And I think one thing that CBT brings to the table is the science behind it. So always looking, if you've got a problem, okay, let's look at problem solving and let's look at the evidence. What's the evidence around this new symptom? And work together to solve the problem. And then finally, collaboration. So it's really important, whatever the label is, if it doesn't feel right, that's okay. We can actually just focus on your goals and the skills that you need help with, regardless of what that code is on paper. A lot of people get diagnosed with GAD, which is generalized anxiety disorder. But actually what that means in practice is very, very different. Again, there's some sort of techniques you can help, but often behind the GAD is a trauma. And if you're not familiar with trauma, you miss the trauma. And if you don't treat the trauma, and then the GAD just stays as well. So quite often it's really important again to not to be too prescriptive around the diagnosis, to really have that diagnosis plus formulation. So how does it work in practice? What is the treatment plan for this? And it can always be amended. I'm a great believer in actually working dynamically with people so that regardless of the diagnosis, we can review, evaluate. Is this working for you? A classic example is somebody, I'm going to name her Amira for confidential reasons, came to me. This is very classic after being told she's got anxious. But what happened is she also had a number of intrusive stuck memories after a serious accident, which is classic trauma. But again, she didn't fit the criteria for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so she couldn't be called as actually having from trauma, even though she had trauma. So once we named the trauma, she was able to access the proper treatment. And then 12 sessions later, she was sleeping again, driving again, and back at work. So again, it's really important to understand the diagnosis and make sure you haven't missed anything. So, practical tips. So, number one, the label is useful to get to the initial skills. So, going back to what I said earlier, this is a diagnosis. Let's start with the specific treatment plans that are recommended for this diagnosis. Number two, create a formulation together. Create a treatment plan together. Okay, so let's put everything on the table. And so what I think we're looking at is this is the plan here. And the plan would include what triggers you, what thoughts does that create, what feelings does that create, what behaviors does that create, both good and unhelpful, and what are your physical responses. Challenge any stigma. So maybe the diagnosis, it lands very heavily on that individual. So either the person feels very labeled and misunderstood, or they actually feel freed. So what's really, really important is that person is seen as a person, not a label, not just a diagnosis. So it's really important that you focus on the goals for treatment and also the individual's resources and strengths. Point number 4, always be aware of either dual diagnosis or making sure symptoms aren't missed. Take a fresh look. Make sure that physical health needs aren't underestimated. Another example is people who may struggle with eating disorders or gambling or alcohol addiction or drug addiction. Often beneath that is, again, more trauma. And if you start to address the trauma as well as the addiction, that person is so much better. If you just take away the addiction, the trauma can be so overwhelming for the person that they can't cope and they go back to the addiction. So that idea of actually having like a dual diagnosis can really help a person understand what's going on, understand the whole person and what's going on for that person. Okay, so you're more than a label. You're a person with experiences. You're a person with values. You're a person with resources. You're a person with a future. To summarize, the pros of diagnosis is that it can speed up the access to right evidence-based help. It can help your services to be better aligned and can validate your experience. The downside is that labels can invite stigma, biased decisions, and miss the rich context of your life. So the way to overcome this is just to ensure that diagnosis can be a useful map, but you must always bring your own personalized formulation, your most personalized, compassionate understanding, and developing a skills-based focus plan. So thank you very much for listening. If you want any more information on the resources that I provide, you just need to go to my website, wendycastellino.com, or just Google me and all my social media will come up. Thank you so much for listening today, and I wish you a lovely day.